Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, we can hear me. Okay. Welcome to tonight's faculty research presentation, The Trinity and Time Travel. I am not Dawn Emsalem, the director of the Library Services, but Dawn did write this bio for Dr. Catterson. I am usually the behind-the-scenes woman. My name is Olivia Jones. I'm the Special Programs and Instruction Librarian, but I am happy to welcome Dr. Catterson today. Dawn sat down with Dr. Catterson last week, and he shared a little bit of the adventures of his life to date and the amazing path he blazed to his current role as Associate Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Ph.D. program in Humanities and Technology. Dr. Catterson was born in New York and raised on Long Island. The first person in his family to attend college, he responded to early setbacks by enlisting in the Army and serving 4 years on active duty, including in the first Gulf War, where he was stationed in Kuwait and Hawaii. He also spent 6 years in the Army Reserve. During his service, he was sent to the Defense Language Institute and was one of the only 2 students out of 10 who completed a year-long immersion program in Chinese, achieving fluency in Mandarin. This led him to work for the NSA as an interpreter, including translating for Secretary of State Warren Christopher. While completing his degree in Chinese language and literature in Hawaii, he met his wife at a Chinese language church. Right? Yeah. After the Army, Dr. Catterson went to Boston University for an interdisciplinary program in science, philosophy, and theology. Studying under a physicist, Dr. Catterson's first publication explored what we can learn about God through science, the field of quantum cosmology. After his primary advisors retired, he switched his advisors and to focus on foundational issues in philosophy and mathematical logic, metaphysics, and epistemology. Wow, I am having a time. I'm a librarian. His most recent publications apply logical modeling to the concept of God, attempting to make sense of some of the paradoxes that seem to arise in the concept of a perfect being. I'm so grateful to Dr. Catterson for sharing this fascinating story and now his research with us. I hope you will join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Troy Catterson.
When Dawn first showed me the bio, I said, wow, you make me sound a lot more interesting than I really am. So it's kind of like one of those movie highlights where you see the highlights and you go, this is a great movie. Well, sorry if I disappoint you with the movie itself. So first I'd like to tell you about what my general interest is and how I do my research. And really you could say that I'm interested in what is called concept exploration. And I guess a story can help you understand why that's so important, okay? It's a dumb story, so it'll introduce you to what my students have to suffer through every class. There was a panda, and this panda walks into a restaurant and orders some food, orders some bamboo, and finishes eating up the bamboo. The waiter brings the check to the panda. The panda takes out a shotgun and kills the waiter, and then starts to leave. So the owner is shocked, runs after him and says, "You killed my waiter and you didn't even pay." And the panda said, "I'm a panda, buddy. That's what we do. Look it up." So he takes out a dictionary, looks up the word panda, and in it says, East Asian marsupial, eats bamboo, shoots, and leaves. You see, when you start with a bad idea of something, things only get worse, do they? And when you're talking about a bad idea of such an important concept in the world as God, then things can get really bad, can't they? They can get dangerous. They can lead to many deaths. And so I've always been interested, as a person of faith, to explore the Christian concept of God, the Christian concept of a perfect being. What does it mean to say a being is perfect? And what kind of things follow from the ideas of perfection that we have? And one of the interesting things is I'm not the first to have started asking these questions. Many philosophers from Plato to St. Anselm have asked these questions about what a perfect being must be and whether a very idea of a perfect being would actually imply that such a being exists. People like St. Anselm and Descartes believed so and tried to argue so, but many others see the idea of a perfect being as a contradiction in terms, like a square circle. And so 2 questions arose for me when I started studying this stuff, because I was pretty much interested in one idea that comes out of the notion of a perfect being, and that's that a perfect being has to know everything. Okay? So you might say the research that I studied gave some problems to this idea, all right? Think of it like this. Does a perfect being have to exist within time or outside of time? Right? To say that a perfect being exists in time is like you and I. Right now, you're experiencing this talk, and it's happening sequentially for you, right? There's part in the past right now already, and you're hoping more of it's in the past than in the future, maybe, I don't know. And you are, then what? It's progressing through time. Your consciousness isn't all at once, is it? So thus, you and I are what are called temporal beings, or beings that are in time. But many believe that God is the creator of time. That time itself is what you might call something that didn't have to exist. And you can think like that because time, as Aristotle said, is the measure of change. So if nothing existed, nothing would change, and therefore there wouldn't exist anything called time. And so if time is something that didn't have to exist, and God is the creator of everything, then God must somehow be outside of time. But now we have a problem for God's omniscience, for God's all-knowingness. Okay? There's such things called essentially indexical pieces of knowledge. Okay, that's a long term for a really simple thing. How many of you have ever tasted alligator meat? Okay, a couple. All right. Anybody want to volunteer what it tastes like? Chicken, right? Chicken. But not really, right? I mean, if you ate alligator meat, you wouldn't mistake it for chicken, would you? No. So really the only way you could know what alligator meat tastes like is by what? Eating, experiencing it, right? So you might say there are certain types of knowledge that can only be had through direct experience and not through just understanding the concept of it. Okay, that's what is called indexical because it's knowledge that can only come from a particular perspective. Does that make sense? So now, if God is outside of time, then God doesn't experience things sequentially like you and I. God would experience everything all at once. He would experience the whole timeline in a way that's completely different than we could ever experience. And so, thus, it would seem that if God's outside of time, that God can't know what it's like to experience things sequentially. But then, is God really all-knowing? Because there seems to be some essential bits of knowledge that we would have as temporal beings that God can't have. See the problem? But on the other hand, so what some have said is then God has to be inside of time. And then that would solve that problem, wouldn't it? Not really. It would bring another problem. Okay? And here's the problem. God's supposed to know the future. But how would God know the future if God can't see it? Especially if there's a such thing called free will. If there's free will, then the future can't be set for a lot of things, can it? But if God knows what you will do, then isn't it set before you do it? And so the traditional solution to this was come up with by a guy named Boethius, a Roman philosopher, who argued that's why God must be outside of time. Because what you see as future, God sees as present. And so it's not that God's determining it, it's God's just witnessing it as it's occurring. So thus, God must be, according to this logic, right? God's going to know everything. Then God must be both inside of time and what? Outside of time. But then that seems to give us a contradiction, doesn't it? And so you might say that my research is, can this contradiction be resolved? Can you come up with a model, a picture of God that would allow God to have his cake and eat it too? Be both inside of time and outside of time, and yet not be a contradiction. And so you might say that's the question that motivated my research. And all research starts with a question. It is a burning question for whatever you're asking. It's a burning question. You want to answer it. And then what you ask yourself is, okay, once I understand the question, what would it take to go about answering it? That's what is called your methodology. Okay? Is understanding what kind of evidence you would need, or what kind of procedure you would need to go about answering your question. Okay? The kind of procedure I'm using is a purely logical procedure of what is called model construction. Okay? You construct a model to show what is called the possibility of something. It may not be true at all, but I'm not concerned whether it's true. I'm concerned whether you have to leave your brain at the door to believe it, to walk in church, right? And so it turns out that the model I'm going to give of God actually, if it works, would be also a model of one of the most mysterious doctrines in Christianity. The idea that 3 equals 1. That there is how many gods? 1. But somehow this one God exists as 3 distinct persons. How many have always found that weird? It seems like bad math, doesn't it? Yeah. Because it is in one sense bad math, because if you look at the logic of identity, if I say Jesus equals God, the Father equals God, and the Holy Spirit equals God, right? Then by the transitivity of identity, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, then the Father should equal Jesus, right? But he doesn't. See the problem? And so, thus, it just seems like bad math, but on this model, I show how it's not, how it actually could be true. I'm not arguing that it is true. Again, this is a model. And a model gives us a way of thinking about things that allows us to go forward in our thinking. All science depends on models. Without a good model, science doesn't advance. Okay? All right, so the second thing is actually the model I'm giving is very similar to another philosopher named Brian Leftow. He came up with what is called the time traveler model of the Trinity. And it's very easy to illustrate, okay? It illustrates how, for example, say I go into a time machine, how I could meet myself in the past. And so I step into a time machine, I travel into the past, say, on my present age now, somewhere above 21, and with a lot of experience, and I go back into time and meet my 16-year-old self. Okay? There are movies like this, aren't there? Back to the Future is the most famous, right? And then what happens? Well, I have a conversation with myself, don't I? My 16-year-old self is going to experience his future self as a different person, isn't he? And I am going to experience my 16-year-old self as a different person. And we're going to be able to be in an interpersonal relationship with each other, aren't we? We're going to be able to have arguments with each other. Maybe my 16-year-old self will be like, I don't believe you're me. I thought I would be much better looking or something. So you can see how there could be all sorts of interpersonal interaction that goes, and how there could even be disagreement. And it wouldn't be weird anymore, would it? And so that's the cool thing. He argues that what you have in the Trinity is a similar kind of thing. Something could have 3 different centers of consciousness, you might say, but yet still be the same personal being. But there's a problem with this model. It relies on the possibility of time travel into the past. And there are a lot of problems with that. For example, if I get into a time machine, I could go into the time machine and not go visit myself. I could go visit my parents and convince them not to get together. And then what happens? I'm not born, right? And how did I survive to get in the time machine? See how a contradiction results? These are called grandfather paradoxes. And then there's another kind of paradox. It's that you might have seen this movie, how many have heard of Star Trek before? Okay. So there's a recent, like, not so recent, not the most recent one, but a movie where it's all about the young Captain Kirk and Spock and all of them, and they're in the academy, and the Spock goes back in time and tells Scotty the formulas to invent warp drive. And then Scotty invents warp drive. So who's the inventor? Well, the problem is this. Scotty was the one who invented it, okay? So that's how Spock knew it. And so that's how Spock could tell Scotty. See the problem? It's like a chicken and an egg, isn't it? Except worse. And so you see, past time travel is not a good model of the Trinity because it presupposes that it's possible that you can travel into the past, and it doesn't seem possible. So what my model tries to do is show how a being, okay, could travel from eternity, not into the past, but into time itself. Okay? And that this would create the same kind of distinction within the same being of different centers of consciousness, like time travel, but without the problems of past time travel. And that's, so I'm trying to kill two theological stones with two theological birds with one theoretical stone. Okay? All right, so my temporal model thus aims to show two things. How God could be both temporal and atemporal, and therefore have total knowledge, experiential knowledge, therefore still be omniscient. And how God could travel in and out of time and create this Trinitarian structure. Okay? In other words, God outside of time, traveling inside of time, and then traveling back out again, would create three subjective centers of consciousness. Okay? So that's a mouthful. So let's see how we're going to do that, or how I plan on doing it. Okay? This is sort of a diagram to show what you might say the general structure. We're going to assume that it's possible first, and then see what follows. So God outside of time, I'm going to call God. Okay? God inside of time, Git. And God exiting time, Get. Think of it as three different phases of God's life. Just like there's young Sheldon, right? And then Locke. Sheldon the adult, right? Two different phases, and then maybe Sheldon the old man. I'd love to see a series about old Sheldon. Okay? And so think of this as this travel would create three different phases of God's existence. Okay? God outside of time, God inside of time, God exiting time, or as I like to sometimes call it, God eternalizing time. Right? Then some purpose I got, God is where? It's in the past, right? I got it. Got that? Okay. Get, in Southern dialects, is present tense. Okay. And get, I will get. So there's a kind of bad punishness to my model here. Okay, so what you think is, okay, God goes into time, and then what we do is you would have, if you look, that square is like simultaneity. It's like the whole timeline would be present to God outside of time, including what happens to God inside of time. God inside of time would be experiencing each moment one at a time. And then, at some point, God exits time, and this being, Get, would again experiencing all the time moments simultaneously, but with a history. Okay? So, you have God, Get, and Get would all be participants, therefore, in every event. So let's just take a particular event. The event, say, of this lecture. Okay? So, first of all, God would experience this lecture and every other event before the lecture and after the lecture in history all at once. Okay? It would all be in what would be called an eternal present for God. And that's why God would be able to know the future. Because from God's perspective, it's not future. It's present. Okay? So Get would experience every event, like we said, sequentially, but because Get is God's second phase, then Get would have a memory of all God's experiences. Thus, Get would be a continuation of God. You all with me so far? Lost you yet? Okay. All right, so now, Get would experience every event again simultaneously, but would have memories of having experienced them sequentially. And the memory of having experienced them all before all that at once. So that's what you would see is each phase of God's existence would take the previous phase up into this phase's consciousness. Okay? So the question is, what would that do? Would this be just like you and I? Like I remember my child, say I had perfect eidetic memory. So I'm able to remember every event of my childhood, of young Troy. Then I still don't experience my young Troy as a different person, do I? So why isn't this just a single person with 3 different phases? We're going to now show you why this has to create that similar kind of thing that past time travel does. Okay. The key here is, first of all, from the perspective of each of the timelines, okay, they would all perceive each other simultaneously. Okay. Why? Well, first of all, God outside of time cannot really leave eternity. Here's why. We can think of eternity as having exactly one eternal moment. So if I asked, when did God leave time? Leave eternity? It would have to be at the exact same moment that God was in eternity. And that would be a contradiction, wouldn't it? Because that would mean God is both in and out of eternity at the same time. So therefore, if eternity has exactly one moment, then God, in coming into time, can't have left eternity. Okay? Hence, God would experience the event of this lecture from both the eternal perspective and from the sequential perspective at the same time of the event. Okay? Get would have, again, this experience of E in a single moment, just like God, but now would have a memory of having experienced it sequentially. And therefore, again, all 3 would be, you might say, face-to-face with each other. Okay? So, thus, these phases of God's existence would exist simultaneously with each other, even though continuous. And that sounds like a contradiction, so we have to show how it wouldn't be. We have to now create a model of how this is possible. Okay. But first, let's explain how that divides their consciousness. Because you might think of God as, Boethius said this, that maybe it's just God has one more sense than we do, like a sixth sense. So I can't know what it would be like to be a bat. Because bats have a special kind of sense called echolocation that is so fine-tuned that the way a bat hears is like what I see. But that's the best I can get at it. I can't know what it's like to be a bat unless somehow I got that extra sense of echolocation. And so Boethius says maybe that's like what it is with God. Maybe God is still a single subject of experience, but experience just like I experience visually things and I'm hearing things at the same time. Maybe there's this eternal sense that is experiencing things all the time at once, while God's temporal sense is experiencing sequentially. So that's what we got to show. No, this would actually divide their consciousness. Okay? So first of all, one of the things we had known about consciousness, you might say, from the time of Kant, is that what makes distinct experiences of the same person or subject, is their ability to be unified into a single experience, a single consciousness. So right now, you are hearing things, you're seeing things, you're feeling things, all these different experiences. You could pay attention to each of them individually, couldn't you? But you're not doing that. You're actually subconsciously uniting them all into a single experience called boredom, right? No. And so what you do is, we can say that those are all parts of your consciousness, a single person, precisely because if, for example, we had one person who could only see, another person who could only hear, another person who could only touch, right? They would all be experiencing individually maybe your sensations, but they wouldn't be able to unify all of them into a single consciousness. You see that? And that's how we know that wouldn't be a single person's consciousness. So thus, if it needs to be unifiable, and we can show what the main necessity of unification is, in other words, what's the main thing you need for a unity of consciousness, and we show that's not there, then we've shown what we want to show. So now, this can only happen for you and I, because all of these distinct experiences are happening in the same timeline. Nothing else unifies them. Visual experiences can be unified in what you might call a visual coordinate system. Audible experiences in a sequential. So you can frame all these things and do that in what are called manifolds. But when you bring all these different things together, the only thing that unifies them is the fact that they occur in the same subjective timeline of the person. Okay? But now, here's the thing. Thus, subjective timelines that are distinct from each other, people with different histories are different persons. Okay? And that's what happens with the three phases. We already showed you that. You and I and Git would experience things one at a time. This event one at a time. Therefore, what I just said would be in Git's history, but would be in God's present, wouldn't it? And Git's present. So thus, God and Git wouldn't have the same timeline, would they? It makes no sense to say the same person experienced something 2 minutes ago, but also experienced the exact same thing, the exact same event in time, right now. And Get would have 3 experiences of the same event. Because he would experience it now in the present, have experienced it in the past, and haven't experienced in God's perspective. So thus you would have 3 distinct timelines. And that would mean you have 3 distinct subjective centers or perspectives of consciousness. Now, a quick thing is this can kind of explain why you might say God could be seen as the Father. Because God is the cause or generates getting. See that? By coming into time. And then what you see we get is most explanations of the Holy Spirit is Spirit is seen from the Christian or biblical point of view as the supreme integration of reality. So really get is the combination of God and get, its experiences. And thus the relationship between the two. And thus you might see, thus why the Holy Spirit is seen to come in Catholic theology as to come from the Father through the Son. Okay? And so, now let's talk about how this is possible. I call this ETT, not extraterrestrial, but eternal time travel. Okay? First of all, we have to explain what time travel is. Otherwise, we're going to, again, be talking past each other. Okay? A very famous philosopher named David Lewis said this. I'm just going to read part of it. What is time travel? Inevitably, it involves a discrepancy between time and time. Any traveler departs and then arrives at his destination. The time elapsed from the departure and arrival is the duration of the journey. But if he is a time traveler, the separation in time between departure and arrival does not equal the duration of his journey. How can it be that the same two events, his departure and his arrival, are separated by two unequal amounts of time? I reply by distinguishing time itself, external time, as I shall call it, from the personal time of a particular time traveler. Roughly, that which is measured by his wristwatch. His journey takes an hour of his personal time, but the arrival is more than an hour after the departure in eternal external time. If he travels toward the future, or if he's going into the past, it's less than. So let's put this in real layman's terms. I get into a time machine. It takes 2 seconds to travel 50 years. Okay? Into the future. Normally, it would take 50 years to travel 50 years, right? We're all in a time machine. But the travel into the future, it takes shorter. So what does that mean? It means that time travel actually isn't really traveling. Okay? It really involves a splitting of time series. So you might say the person, before I get to the time machine, I'm going according to everyone else's time clock. All our watches are synchronized. And then I get in the time machine, and what? And now my time diverges from yours. My watch will actually slow down. Slow down to the point that whereas all the events that you go through took 50 years, right? My watch will have only traveled 2 minutes. So all those events will be there, but now scrunched into 2 minutes. So what I really have is something like this, is time travel is my personal timeline splits and changes the occurrence of events. When they occur, how far apart they occur from each other, though not the before and after. Okay? So this explains thus how God could remain in eternity, yet go into time without traveling. It really is a splitting of timelines. But that splitting of timelines would cause a different timeline for God in time. So now, another thing that we learned from this is that the possibility, what we see is travel into different time series still would preserve all the same events. The same event could occupy 2 different timelines. Just think, I get into the time machine, that's the moment of my departure. That's an event. If I asked what time that occurs, it will be given 2 different times depending on which watch you're looking at. Does that make sense? The time of arrival will be given 2 different times, doesn't it? 50 years versus 2 minutes. And so what you see is that when we're talking about time travel, what we're really talking about is not something that splits things so irreparably that events don't occur in both, or that they don't affect each other. So you can have beings, theoretically speaking, that can interact with each other even though they're governed by 2 different timelines. Okay? The science backs this up. Okay? The splitting is possible because of what we call the special theory of relativity. How many heard of Einstein, right? Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, his first theory is called the special theory because it's all about this notion of space and time. And what he argues is that if we take seriously the experiments that showed that the speed of light is the same, will be measured the same in all frames of motion, then time travel is possible. Just think of it like this. Normally what we think of is that if I'm moving on an object and someone else is standing still, and somebody throws a baseball from the standing still, say the baseball's going 70 miles an hour, and then someone else is, and say someone is on a train that's going 70 miles an hour, and I throw that baseball in the direction, same direction as the travel of the train. Then, according to our intuitions, the person on the train is going to experience the ball as not traveling at any speed, right? It's going to be stationary from their perspective. So this is our ordinary idea, that if you measure the ball going in the opposite direction, you're going to add 70 miles an hour, aren't you? It's going to be experienced as traveling away from you at twice that speed. This is what Galileo argued and everybody thought in traditional physics. But then we measured the speed of light. And we realized that it didn't matter what speed you were going at, it was still measured at the exact same speed. That's weird, isn't it? Okay? So Einstein took this and said, let's take that seriously and agree that in every frame of motion, you're going to have the speed of light as measured the same. Then what's going to happen is that the faster you get toward the speed of light, the slower your clocks are going to be. Okay? So how many heard of a thing called the twin paradox? Okay, this was, imagine you get somebody, 2 twins. You get one, you put him in a spaceship, okay? And the other, you leave on Earth. Then the twin in the spaceship goes close, say 75% of the speed of light. Then what will happen is this. Take him on a trip, round trip, bring him back. Let's say the journey was 10 years from the perspective of the clock on the ship. That person will have aged 10 years. When they come back, though, their other twin will have aged 32 years. And so, thus, the theory predicts that you could conceivably travel into the future, see? And in fact, experiments show that that actually is what occurs. You've heard of particle accelerators, right? So what they've done is they have stationary particles, and then they take other particles, uranium particles, and they accelerate them close to the speed of light. And what did they discover? That when they slow them down, the ones that were accelerated decayed at a slower rate than the ones that were not accelerated. In other words, the whole process of time slowed down for them. Okay? So how do we apply all this, okay? What we see is that time travel causes these twins to occupy different timelines, okay? And it's done not through a traveling, but what you could call a causing. So this person gets in the ship, accelerates the ship. The event of acceleration is what causes the difference in timelines, isn't it? So you could say that that twin's period of time, that particular event of traveling in the ship, causes her timeline to split. Okay? So thus, what would time travel be? Time travel would just be this, that you have a segment of the person's existence that is such that an event occurs that causes the splitting of the timeline, so she has a new phase of her existence that's governed by a new timeline. Okay? So thus we can define how God travels from eternity into time. We could say this. It's a mouthful, but hopefully you understand. God travels into time from eternity just in case there's a segment of God's existence that occupies eternity, okay? And a segment of God's existence that occupies the regular timeline I call TS. Moreover, the segment that occupies eternity is the cause of the segment that occupies TS. Okay? God travels from time into eternity if and only if the former proposition is true. In other words, a segment of God's existence is in time, and the segment is in eternity. But now you flip it and say the part that's in time causes the segment that's in eternity. Okay? Now we understand how God could travel without travel. So, thus, what I can argue is the big stumbling block to eternal time travel is actually this thing called atemporal causation. Okay? It just seems make no sense to say that something that is not temporally related to something else could cause something else. But, in fact, this is what is assumed by most people who believe in God and that God is eternal, is that God creates the universe in such a way that it creates the whole universe at once, in eternity, the whole timeline. Now this makes sense from the perspective of science, actually. Because think about the laws of science. If the laws are going to explain why something occurred, they can't merely describe things. Okay? What do I mean? I could describe something and find a pattern, right? And then in finding that pattern, say this is what always happens. But that's just a pattern, and does it always have to happen? No. So a law is stronger than that, isn't it? A law says this is not just what happens, but what must happen. So, thus, a law determines events, doesn't it? It determines. But at what time does the law exist? That makes no sense. It makes no sense that the laws exist in time. Because they're operative regardless of the time. They're always the same. So you could say that even in science, we have this idea of atemporal causation. In other words, a type of thing that determines things but doesn't determine them within time. The laws of time would be examples of that. Okay? So, thus, it is possible, I argue, that God outside of time could cause conscious states that are continuations of God's own timeless states, but are temporal states. Okay? Because it's possible if God can create you and I as temporal beings and create us to have sequential states, but do it atemporally, as for God, an atemporal being to create temporal states. You see that? So what God would have to create is what? His own states in such a way that they're temporal. So we would have to argue that God is distinct from God's conscious states. Okay? Why? Well, if you believe God has free will, then couldn't have God decided not to create anything at all? So then, we know that God, having created, willed creation. Had a plan. Had a goal. But if God didn't have to create, then those states of consciousness didn't have to exist, did they? God would have had different plans, different willings, different perceptions. Well then, God would have still existed, but those states of consciousness wouldn't have existed, would they? and therefore God can't be equivalent to God's conscious states. Because if A and B are equivalent to each other, then what? If you don't have A, then you don't have B. But you can have A without B here, so therefore they're not the same. Okay, does that make sense? All right, still with me? All right, so thus, what you could say is, as long as atemporal causation is possible, then what? Then God can create states that contain God's, not previous states, when God inside of time has memories. They're not really memories because they're not in his past. But they're like memories in that what? They're completed. And you might say, how is that possible that something can be complete but not in the past? Like this. When I see you right now, my seeing is complete. But it's at the same moment that you are. So you might say, or if I take, for example, a fingerprint, and I press the ink to the piece of paper, the pressing is complete, right? And the result is at the same time, isn't it? So you could say that what happens in Git is that all of the eternal experiences are background states that are complete, but not in the past. In many languages, there's a distinction between the two. For example, in Hebrew and in Chinese, you don't have tenses. You have a thing called aspect. In English, we call this the present perfect. Okay? If I say, like Archimedes says, Eureka, I found it. When did it happen? When did he find it? When he says, I found it. At the moment that he's saying it. See that? Thus, it's complete, but it's in the present, isn't it? So, what the problem is in English, we associate tense with completeness, don't we? And therefore, we think the two are the same. But they're not, logically speaking. All right, I'll stop here. I'm 3 minutes late from my timeline. But let's open this up. So that's basically the kind of thing that I've been doing, and you all still awake, so yes, do it until that. So, questions?
I'll pass the mic around.
I don't know if I need the mic, but thanks. So this is very interesting, Troy. What are your next steps? Where are you going to go with this? What is your end goal?
I'm then going to apply this to certain theological questions, actually, and certain ethical questions. I'll talk about the ethical ones because it's more relevant to the Mercy mission of the school. You might say one of the biggest problems in ethics is how to explain how humans are of equal value to each other. Of equal value, right? Should be treated with equity. Okay? But yet, every human is different, aren't they? So you might say that in the Enlightenment, the idea was there was something in humans that we all possessed equally, that there would be the ground of our equal value. The problem is, as Nietzsche argued, that's a democratic prejudice. It isn't grounded in the reality of human beings, is it? Let's say we want to take humans' rationality, like Kant tried to do. Right? We want to take humans' rationality as the basis for our equality. Are some people more rational than the others? Unfortunately, yes. Just look at the political situation. You know this. So rationality then would create a hierarchy, wouldn't it? Well, so take anything that we value as humans and say that's what makes us valuable, and you're going to find a hierarchy, aren't you? And so, thus, Nietzsche argues there's no rational basis for equality. Okay? But the interesting thing is there is a Christian tradition that says that actually this equality is based on the Trinity. Okay? So if you go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, you see it says, let us create man in our image. Okay? Isn't that weird? How many gods are there? Well, they were saying us. We. Right? And in the Hebrew, it's very clear that they're mixing the two. Because when it says, let us create man in our image, it's the we plural. But then it says, then God, singular, created them. The image. And then it says, let us create him male and female. Let us create him, singular, okay, in the Hebrew. Male and female. That's weird, right? Adam is one, but Zakar u'Nekeva, two. So Augustine argued that what makes the image of God, which is the basis for our value, is not our rationality, but the fact that each of us, by ourselves, are only part of the image. And that it's only the plurality together that you have the whole image of God. And so what makes each of us valuable is we reflect what happens in the Trinity, this absolute unity in an absolute diversity. And therefore, what makes me valuable to all you is that I have a part of the image that you don't have. So think of it like a puzzle. Every piece of the puzzle is equally essential to the whole picture, isn't it? And therefore, what makes us equal value is not what we have in common, but what we have uniquely. See this? And it's our relationships that make us one. And so Augustine actually argued that the human race is not actually a bunch of individuals, it's a single tree branching out. And that's all. And so you might say that if we can make sense of the Trinity then, you see this absolute unity and absolute diversity without contradicting ourselves, then we have a foundation, a conceptual foundation that's not just a pie in the sky of what makes us all equally valuable and therefore of equal concern to the state. So that's one thing that I'm planning on applying this to.
More questions?
I have a question. I know you've been working on this since 2004. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I was actually very mad because I actually thought of the time traveler thing before Leftow, but he published before I did. So it was kind of like Newton and Leibniz with the calculus. So I can't sue Leftow because he didn't steal my stuff. He thought of it independently, but anyway, yeah.
Well, so my question is, what advice do you have for my students in the senior thesis class who need research project, but they are 21, so they don't have 21 years. So
Yeah.
what can they do so that they can catch up and time travel and produce?
First, invent a time machine going into the past. But I would say the thing that you always have to do is realize your unique perspective on things. If you notice, I didn't give up when I saw Leftow came up with a time traveler. Nice. Why? Because actually his model sucked. That's a technical term. Okay? It sucked because it said, if square circles are possible, then the Trinity is possible. Right? If past time travel is possible, then the Trinity is possible. But past time travel isn't possible. You see that? And so thus, it didn't help much. So, and I had always actually thought of it in terms of eternity traveling into time. And so even though it seemed like he preempted me, you never really preempted because your perspective is unique. Okay? So you're going to find actually that helps you in your research because now you have a conversation partner. All research is a continuation of a conversation. Okay? Even if you're the first one starting it, but you never are. Okay? Nobody has totally new ideas. This is why even Newton said, I stood on the shoulders of giants. There hadn't been people like Kepler and Galileo and others, and he wouldn't have been able to do what he did. And if there hadn't been Newton, there wouldn't have been an Einstein. So in the same sense, what you have to do is have the confidence that if you have an idea and you really think it's good, that when you find it in other people, you're not going to find it exactly the same as yours. And then the question is, can you add your perspective to flesh out that idea. So have that kind of confidence in yourself that that's possible. Because as I'm arguing, each and every one of us are different. And therefore, our perspective is different. And therefore, we're going to add to the elephant. Okay? And what do I mean by that? There's the old story of the blind men and the elephant. Anybody hear this story before? Okay, some of you haven't, so I'll tell it. 5 men who were blind, never able to see, born blind. They go to the zoo to experience an elephant. One touches the elephant's ear and says, "Wow, an elephant's like a big leathery sheet of paper." The other touches the trunk and says, "Wow, the elephant is like this big leathery rope. You're all wrong." The other one says, "No, it's like a big wall." The other says, "No, it's like a tree trunk." And so they all thought each other was wrong because it seemed to contradict their picture, didn't it? But if they had just gotten together and put the picture together, they would have gotten the elephant, wouldn't they? And that's the elephant in the room. Okay? The elephant in the room is that you're not in competition with people to be first. Okay? There's no the competition. You won the competition. You have a perspective that if you flesh it out and find your voice and stop copying other people, you will what? You will contribute a side of the elephant that no one else experienced.
Another question? We got Joe over here.
So this might have just gone over my head when you were talking about God having free will. But if God is in time and outside of time, on either end of the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
How, if God is simultaneous or multitaneous,
Yeah.
how, if God sees the consequence and the precedence of all events, how does God have free will, or would a person have free will?
Okay, excellent question. So, I mean, one way to frame your question is to say, then wouldn't God know in advance what he's going to do?
Right.
Yeah, and therefore it'd be determined, right? But free will, when we talk about human beings who are limited beings, what we're talking about is that there has to be these alternative possibilities, right? Because you and I have a beginning. And therefore, if something causes me, and I can never be the ultimate cause of my actions, right? If there's no way for us to put a break in that chain, so that there could be possibilities, right? So there has to be a point with you and I, when we talk about free will, where there's like this, the future is open. Because we're limited beings. Okay? But if God is the first cause of everything, then there would be nothing that ever causes God to do anything, right? Except who? God. And so therefore, whatever God does, God would have had the power to do otherwise, but didn't do it. Because often we confuse eternal with necessary. Okay? And that's not true, because couldn't history have gone differently? Couldn't maybe Hitler have won the war? So how many of you have seen Man in the High Castle?
Oh,
right?
great show.
Yeah. So if that's the case, we know this, that since it's already in the past that Hitler lost the war, then it's always been true that Hitler lost the war, and it's sort of an eternal truth now, isn't it? But just because it's eternal didn't mean it had to be true. So when we say God could have done otherwise, we're not saying it's not eternally set. We're just saying there could have been a possible other way the world could have gone, right? That God would have chosen differently. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Good question.
Hey, Dr. Catterson.
Tom?
So my question is, I noticed in kind of the latter part of the presentation, you were using language of creation, describing God creating God's own conscious states.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how you feel that fits into a Nicene definition of the Trinity in the sense of begotten, not made.
Yeah. Okay, so that, when I use the word create, I only mean cause. So it's saying begotten. One way to talk about it is generated. Okay? So why use the word generation rather than creation? Because often creation is seen as out of nothing. Okay? Whereas God going into time is actually just splitting his timeline. So God is causing the existence of get, right? But not as a totally different being, but as a polything, you might say, right? And so thus in a sense of begetting. A being of the same nature, but a different person. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Good. Good for catching that.
Questions? Okay, well, please give Dr. Catterson a very warm applause. Thank you so much for coming out to hear about his research. Please continue the conversation and enjoy some refreshments. And please mark your calendars for Thursday, October 16th, when Dr. Nathaniel Kitchell shares his research on Antarctica with his lecture, Archaeology Beyond the End of the World. Thank you all for coming.